Hello, thanks for coming. Oh, thanks for coming. My name is Ryan Holmberg. I am a manga historian, translator, editor, agent, various things. Also a university professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, though I live near Baltimore. This is Brian Baynes. Brian, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, my name is Brian Baynes. I do Bubbles Fanzine, which is a comics fanzine magazine. It's been going since 2019, and so inside is reviews of new books that have come out. So the past 5 years, I've reviewed, I don't even know, hundreds and hundreds of new comics that have come out, and interviews people who generally have new books coming out. It's kind of the idea behind the magazine. And yeah, so I've done 20 issues so far. Yeah, but since starting Bubbles, I made the first one. There it is on the right. And I kind of just made it because I'm a big fan of comic fanzines, which maybe if you've been to a old comic shop, they have old fanzines for sale, and they're really fun. And to me, in comics, being a medium that hasn't been heavily respected by academia until maybe the last 20 years, maybe even less than that, fanzines is where like the real history is. And so I love buying old fanzines and reading reviews and reading documentation about the comics industry through the point of views of diehard fans. And so anyways, I made that first one kind of just as a tribute. Like I was like, this will be fun. Like I love comic fanzines. I want to make one. So it has interviews. Who is in this? So this one has some manga. My goal was to cast my net really wide. It's still my goal is to cover comics that, like, for example, even with issue 3, if you're a Brian Blumworth fan who does very psychedelic-based comics, there's chances that maybe you've never read a Ryan Holmberg book or vice versa. And so I wanted to bring people in and to get people to expose them to new work, by just being into one thing. And, you buy it for one thing, and then maybe you get to expand your horizon. But even with the first book, or the first one, it had interviews with a couple translators, which is something I've always been interested in. James Hudnall, who worked on My the Psychic Girl, which is one of famously noted as maybe like the first manga series to be translated into English. Like,
it was published, I think, in the late 1980s in Japanese. It was a collaboration between Eclipse Comics on the West Coast and then the early version of Viz. Before Viz was an independent company, they did a series, I think 4 different manga titles, published as American-style floppy comics. So it's kind of an unexplored history. So I think it's been interesting that Brian's kind of gone back and try to research a bit of early manga localizers and translators.
Yeah, I have quite a fascination with 90s manga translation. I have a big collection of Viz Media translations. I just find that, I'm 32, so I wasn't really around, and I kind of came to manga only in my early 20s, but I find that era very interesting because it's like you grew up reading comics maybe through the 70s and 80s, and then in the 90s, you have this entire new world of comics just thrown across the American world. So it's like interesting to me, like what was chosen and what became famous, and like still how our manga history in the English-speaking world is constructed based upon like what was chosen to be translated, and I think that kind of feeds into like the projects that Ryan and I have been working on, and what Ryan has done throughout his whole career is like expanding the horizon as to being like, okay, yes, everyone knows even maybe My the Psychic Girl or Dragon Ball Z or the Sailor Moon, but then what are these things that are in Japan people who are into manga already know, but in the English-speaking world, we're like just not hip yet to that history.
I mean, I think Bubbles is interesting outside of Brian and I's collaboration. It's, I'm also a comics historian, a historian of manga. And oftentimes, I got a PhD in art history, and I ended up comics that way. And kind of the issue sometimes with proving that comics should be a viable discipline, say in academia, is that there's very little precedence of comics in academia. So when you have to do certain performative things in academia, like cite pre-existing literature, they expect you to be citing pre-existing academic literature. And when there's no such thing to cite, what are you supposed to do, right? The thing is, this is the case in Japan, but also, in the United States, that the field of comic studies is really done by so-called amateur historians who are no less diligent, no less serious, no less good writers, no less objective as researchers than academics, right? Sometimes even more so because they know more and they're dedicated more and they're not stuck within the rubrics that are required for academia. So, it's like older American comic zines have been very valuable for connoisseurship, figuring out who drew what in Disney Studio or wherever it might be. Yeah. And it's also the case with, Japan. It's like a lot of the older research that I do I specialize on manga from the 50s up to about the 1980s. A lot of the information that I'm able to use is coming from Japanese versions of zines or small press publishing and the afterwards in the back. So you really need the nerds in comics to do the work.
I mean, if anyone here is a Carl Barks fan, Disney Comics, Donald Duck, famously, the first time his name was ever in print was in a fanzine, and it's Comic Art number 7, I think something like that, is in the late 60s, and it was because, diehard fans who recognized his style, which was already tough enough to do, amongst all the other different artists drawing the same characters, they called him the good duck artist for years and years. Like, who's the good duck artist? Anyways.
New York Times best-selling author Jerry Kraft is Patreon for citing and photos. He will be citing until 2:30 p.m. today.
Well, better go.
Yeah, where's our announcement? Anyways, the fan, I still think that kind of like pointing out who, Carl Barks is now such a household name. He's such a legend, and that, that kind of enthusiasm for finding that research, it's still alive today, and it's still like something that's, happening all the time because there's not people, there's no People magazine for comic art or whatever.
So the first time that Brian and I collaborated was Brian approached me to do an interview for issue number 3 back in 2019. And then since then, Brian and I have collaborated on a number of different things, or at least he's hosted articles. I think it's the first one that I totally did for him or published there was after the George Floyd protests. Right at the beginning of COVID, things shut down, and there was different types of protest mural projects in different cities, as you might recall. I was living in Durham, North Carolina until recently, and at the time, so I interviewed a bunch of local black artists who were doing murals inspired by anime and cartoons in different ways and using those for political purposes. So that's one project I did. And then Brian and I, we'll talk about Bat-Kid in a minute, but Brian and I have also bonded as friends, not just because of comics, but also because of baseball. We're both serious baseball fanatics. So we collaborated, Brian headed it up, but I also contributed a baseball and comics issue a number of years ago, which, we were worried, being kind of a niche subject, but this issue turned out really well, I think.
Yeah, it's actually one of my probably best-selling issues, and I get people all the time who have I get people all the time who are like, oh yeah, I don't like baseball, but that's a cool issue, and it opens up with like an article that I wrote that, kind of about how baseball and comics feel similar to me, and maybe it gets a little like spacey in how I made those comparisons, but I think that's kind of the fun of writing, is you can make these comparisons that maybe don't seem so obvious, but and then Ryan wrote a great article.
I did an article about Ichiro, the former Mariners star, and his relationship to manga, because as you may or may not know, sports manga are big, and the king of all sports manga are baseball manga, going back to the late 40s. I'll talk about this book in a minute, but yeah, major baseball players feature a lot in Japanese manga and manga magazines, which is a bit different from the American stereotype of, only couch potatoes read comics. In Japan, there's a lot of athletes who say, had it not been for the fantasy world of sports manga, I probably would have never been inspired to become a professional athlete. So,
Yeah.
And then this is probably, as far as like research material goes, probably the most valuable thing that I published in Bubbles.
Maybe the most valuable in all of Bubbles. It's
So many years ago when I was living in Japan, I was doing some research about the impact of American comic books on post-World War II comics, and particularly Tezuka Osamu. And very kindly, Tezuka Productions let me go visit Tezuka Osamu's former office, his old studio before he died in, I think it was 1989. And in the closet there, in a bunch of beat-up cardboard boxes, they had his whole old American comics collection, which he probably, for the most part, received from American soldiers stationed in Japan during the occupation in the Korean War. And then some things he collected over the years. So I had taken photographs of all of them, and the plan was someday write an article and someday catalog what he had. And that someday never came, and then finally Brian offered to go ahead and look up what all the comics were that I found. So what was it, about 100 items about? So
yeah,
so we did
that's this pick. That stack is so it wasn't.
Yeah, that's the stack.
It wasn't too much. It was like we were looking through a million long boxes.
I think the stack is in the middle. On top is how many Disney comics he had. On the left was how many talking animal comics he had, and on the right was everything else. Okay, so it's definitely not his entire collection, because I know of some comics that he's cited and appropriated that weren't in there, which is also interesting to see. Kind of interested to see what I assumed would be in there and wasn't in there. But I don't know, very valuable resource. This one got reprinted in a Japanese research zine as well, so which was cool.
Yeah, it was a zine that focuses on Tezuka, correct?
Yeah.
Ryan got me a copy. It sits on my desk as a little trophy, as like
major mark in Japan even.
Well, something like you making this zine, and I print these zines. They're Xerox. They're just black and white, and it's only ever been black and white. It's as cheap as you could make it. But it doesn't mean that the content, I've made zines that have been, like that's been republished in Japan, and I made a zine a long time ago about Maury Turner, who did this comic Wee Pals. It's like the first like integrated comic strip. It had black and white characters, and it was like Peanuts, and but he had one before that called Dinky Fellows, and that was republished in the New York Review comics book that was all about the Chicago black cartoonist that was at the MCA, this like art show that they did there. Anyways, it was like a zine that I made like 6 years ago, and I like couldn't believe that it went from like the zine that I would sell for $1 just because I wanted people to have the content, and then like years later, it's like published in like this. I sent them all my stuff to be like, here you go, and they like put it in the book, and it was just like, wow, like just like zines can just like they're not just they can be
trickle up effect definitely with zines.
Yeah.
Oops, wrong way. The most recent thing that I was involved with Brian. Brian, back this past May, did the first Bubbles Con, a conference at Richmond at the public library there, and he had a number of people speak, including myself. So all the talks there ended up as transcripts and articles inside the most recent issue that he has here. You want to say something about Bubbles?
Yeah. So Bubbles Con, if you're at this talk, then you would love Bubbles Con. It's kind of inspired by the earliest comic conventions that took place in New York in like the 60s. This is like the first beginnings of fandom where they would get together and they would just have like dinner, and then like a DC or Marvel cartoonist would just like speak while they like ate spaghetti or something. And I always thought that seemed like there's these amazing pictures of like all these 12-year-olds and adults like all eating together, and then that was like the whole thing. They were like, that's it. And maybe a few people were selling some vintage comics. And so I wanted to do something that was kind of like coming back to where like the talk was the most important thing. I like these tabling events. I go to a ton of them, but I wanted to do something that was more like talks, and then the tabling was actually on the back burner. And so BubblesCon was that. It was just mostly just one day, Saturday, all day at the library, and it was 2 talks. One from my friend Mark, who gave this great talk about a Richmond cartoonist, George H. Ben Jonson, who drew political cartoons in the Richmond Black newspaper in the late 1910s. And then Ryan's talk, and then there was 4 interviews, and so it was just a long day of like talks, and then there was a few stuff for sale in the back. But anyways, all of that was typed out, so if you weren't there, it's okay. The talks aren't on YouTube, but they're all in this magazine, corrected and cleaned up, and they're much more readable, and there's lots of photos. So the whole event like lives on through the zine, which I feel proud about because I believe that the zines will outlive YouTube and stuff. So
Great event. You had great turnout. Probably 100 people in the room. No seats left?
All day. There was people there, and I'm doing it again June 7th. So here's the official announcement. I haven't actually said that online, but it's gonna happen again. And so it's only 7 hours from here. So.
And now, first, I think this is the first book we did together. And
this is
book kind
the
of started
first
off,
book I ever worked on.
Yeah, the book started off as a joke. I was teaching at University of Tokyo for 2 years, and while I was teaching there, because of what I do with comics, it was decided that it'd be a good idea if I actually got on social media and publicize what I do and market myself to the audience that reads social media. So I did that and got addicted to it and started using Instagram is like maxing out the word count every time and doing little research posts. Got kind of obsessed.
You guys didn't even know there was a max word count, did you?
Yeah, there's 220 letter count. But anyway, so I did that, and then Brian, a lot of people really liked it. And Brian was like, let's do a zine of your favorite Instagram posts, which means 20, 20 pages. But my favorite ones are every single one of them. So
Ryan was tabling at Durham Zine Fest, and he didn't have any zines. He was just selling some books, and I was like, where are your zines?
Oh, right. Yeah.
I was like,
if you don't have a zine, you're not a real person in the comics world.
So I was like, where's your zine, man? You should just I was like, just print out your Instagram posts. It's so much better to read.
So it turned out, instead of this book, 300-page book you see here, which strangely enough, sold out not once but twice, and finally went into its 3rd printing. So, which is
so I have like a little less than 100 left, and at the moment, but man, try and scroll back on Instagram. It'll be torture. It would be so much better to flip through this book that has an index and everything. And I still think that this is, one of the things that Ryan brings to the manga world is his first-hand accounts of being in Japan and doing research and meeting artists and working on how to do a translation. And that is like something that I think, maybe until even I was reading his post or looking, like you can't Google that kind of research. You can't find, it's kind of like Japan that's closed off, which I think is, or to some extent. And so this book it still lands as a pretty interesting account of like what Ryan was doing and, what that looks like.
Because maybe some of you, maybe we were at one of the previous talk I did yesterday, but there's very few people that do what I do in the world of manga localization, which is not only translate, but also curate and edit and choose the works and also license the works. I have a lot of contacts with editors and artists in Japan, so I'm capable of setting that up. And I work with publishers that are on the larger side, but also publishers that until yesterday were just doing Xerox zines. But it works out great. It's like very collaborative. Sometimes it's easier to work with a smaller company. Sometimes the money's better working with a smaller company just because it's being divided less, and especially when the smaller company is also good at design and excited about the project, it really helps out. So what this book was essentially kind of 2 years of my life and of the process of what all that is, meeting the artists, doing some research, licensing books, getting in fights with people.
And this book, like I said, it's the first time I'd ever even worked on a project this large. And my whole thesis, I guess, with the books that I've published, having only done 4 and I'm working on the 5th one, that'll come out early next year. But It's just doing books that I think that I'm not like competing with any other publishers. No one is like being like, no, I want to do the Instagram book. But and so
no one wants to do the Instagram.
I want to do the Instagram book because I still, you know, I think it's proven that to be an interesting book, and I've gotten, you know, I'm happy to have it out there, and so yeah.
And then the first translation project we've done was this one. So it's a artist named Inoue Kazuo, who was active in the manga industry going back, I think, to the early 30s. And then he was still active right after World War II. But a typical case, a lot of the manga artists that were active before World War II kind of lost their footing after the war. Some of them died during the war. In his case, he died from tuberculosis during the occupation in 48. So there's a lot of really interesting manga that were kind of orphaned by the fact that the artist died young, or that they were just displaced by radically changing dynamic of manga industry under the influence of Tezuka Osamu after World War II. So this is not the first baseball comic in Japan. There are short strips and some single-panel cartoons going back to the early 20th century. Baseball in Japan goes back to the late 19th century. But this is the first focused manga that's focused particularly on baseball. So at the time, a number of things came together at once. I had been hired by a museum in Ireland to do, they were doing a show about sports in Japan. It was the lead up to the Olympics that eventually got delayed because of COVID. But they wanted me to write something about sports in Japan and manga. So I did something about baseball. So it seemed like a lot of good synergy, and Brian is into baseball, I'm into baseball. So we did this book. And this book was kind of done really well, right? This one also we've printed once, and people seem to really like it. Probably not just because it's manga, and not just because some people do like baseball in the United States, but also it's kind of a cute book and reasonably priced, so I think it kind of has like a stocking stuffer quality to it, which is kind of what's interesting to me, to think about how sizes and formats of books kind of impact how people consume them as well, you know? Because bigger books, I think, sometimes are intimidating, you know? They look like things to read rather than things to have. So I think that book was really helped about that. What was your experience working on your first manga?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of fun. I lettered it. I even hand lettered a part that was supposed to be like a part where he writes in his diary, and I was like, well, my handwriting's bad, so like it'll probably look like a little kid's handwriting, and so I even like you know, I just hand lettered it and kind of just winged it, and you know, it was a really fun project, and it has been interesting because this is the reprint. We reprinted it after we had sold out of the first print run, and it is pretty amazing, just like kind of the wide array. I think if you're like a manga nerd, it's like a must read, but also I think I've had parents tell me that their kid just like love it, or they get a real kick out of just the cute cartooning. And but all of that, I mean, one of the things that I think is something that we did with this book, and also Igaguri, the next book that we'll talk about in a minute, but is that I was talking earlier about how like American history of manga is just different, or the English-speaking history of manga is just different. It's missing pieces, and the manga from the 40s, there's just not a lot translated. You could probably come up with a list of like maybe like 10, or maybe that one. What's the one from the 30s? Tank Tankuro. Yeah, and then Tezuka has a handful, and then Saze-san. Am I saying
some of that?
And then some of that is from the 40s, and then other than that, there's really not a lot translated, and so I would love to do more in the future, because it is just you know, I think the cartooning in here speaks for itself. I guess you can see a little bit up there. It's very cute. It's very playful, and yeah. So it's just manga in English. There's just a lot. Most of it is from like the 60s or most of it. Yeah, and so, but there's a whole decade of, or even before that, of great stuff that I would love to see more of.
Yeah. So we did that book, and then this artist, the Bat Kid artist, he died youngish while he was still working on the series. And the series was really popular Bat Kid was really popular.
I guess we didn't say, if you're not aware, that baseball is huge in Japan.
Yeah.
It's their like national sport, and so Bat Kid, it's baseball exploitation. You know, baseball is the biggest thing, and then Kazuo is like, you know what would be a hit? Would be a baseball themed comic. So, anyways, if you're not aware.
So the magazine he was serializing it, called Manga Shonen, was the first manga-centered kids magazine in Japan right after World War II. And eventually Tezuka Osamu did his first magazine work in that magazine. Like things like Jungle Emperor, which became Kimba the White Lion and arguably Lion King. But anyway, he died. Their most popular artist suddenly died, so they needed a different artist to take up the helm. At the time, the Japanese animation industry, which had been pretty vibrant since the 1930s, was experiencing a lot of problems. Animation being very difficult to do and very expensive, and they hadn't figured out the finances yet. So the animation industry kind of collapsed in the late 1940s in Japan. And all these vets that they had, they basically defected into children's books and manga. And so, people hear a lot about how Tezuka Osamu revolutionized manga right after World War II, and it's absolutely true. But another big effect is the fact that the animation industry basically let go, or they ran away from the animation industry and became cartoonists, right? So you see a lot of impact of animation newly in manga from the 1950s due to this. And this is one such artist. So you start to see the use of like cinematic techniques and different types of, effects and stuff that you would typically only found in animation at the time, making their way into manga at the time, making it manga really dynamic. So this manga, there was other martial arts manga before this, but this is a story about a young man. He's in middle school. He's very, his ethics are perfect. He's well behaved, but he's also awesome at judo. Right? So this combination of this precocious, caring, loving, mature, but also someone who can really kick ass out on the dojo. So he comes together. This is common theme in shonen manga now, right? So this is kind of the first manga that was like that, and also combined with the cinematic techniques that were partially from Tezuka and then partially from the animation industry. And this manga had a huge impact on the contemporary manga scene, so much so that Tezuka got jealous and started trying to trash him in public, and he got in trouble for it. Fukui went up to his house drunk one night and, basically forced him to, kowtow and apologize to him in public. So we did this, but he too died young in 1954. A combination of overwork. He drank a lot. In the late 40s and early 1950s, I think alcohol was pretty sus, like pretty weird things circulating out there. So he died young, and this series was orphaned. But after this, there's a huge judo boom, which kind of folds into the sports and martial arts shonen manga boom that continues to the present. So we're like kind of doing this series where it's about kind of the march of early shonen manga. So this was the second volume we did, and this one was a lot of work. Both these books that we work from, the original artwork doesn't exist, so we're scanning from older editions, mostly reprints, because the original books are also extremely hard to find. Bat Kid, we had a pretty clean, recent reprint from Japan that we were able to scan from. But this one, the Japanese reprints, there have only been two recently, in the 70s and then the 90s. The quality of the reproduction is not great in the Japanese editions. So Brian had a lot of work, Frankensteining different editions together. And also, I think a lot of the halftone screens were really muddy, so you had to replace all of this. You want to talk about your work on this book?
Yeah, I actually had kind of forgotten about this because this book was probably, 2 years or so of...
2 years of not a constant work.
No, but
yeah.
But at the first half, when we had first gone full steam ahead on it, I probably did 100 hours or something of just Photoshopping. I mean, the manga is, it's almost 300 pages, I think, right?
Yeah.
250 pages, 260 pages of manga. And so every single page had something that had to happen. I mean, some editions had better halftones than some of them. It looks like they took the original books and they just went like this and they scanned it, and then that's how they printed it. So there was curved corners. I'd never seen anything so poorly done. And so I had to like fix the corners. I had to be like, okay, the corner needs to not have a curve. And so just hundreds of hours, like 100 hours or so of fixing all of those and deciding like, oh, this panel is good for that page and this panel is good for this page, and making it all look best it can. It is, like Ryan said, it was not possible to get anything close to like the original at the moment. But I think the comic still it stays pretty true to how it originally looked, and we put a lot of work into making it still look consistent like the book. I think if you didn't come to this talk, you would have never known it. It's just a pretty cool look at this book that's now 70 years old. So, but yeah.
I mean, usually when people, in terms of original manga art, there's not much predating the 1960s. They didn't really keep it back then. And even in the 1960s, you can't find a lot of original artwork, which means that whenever you do an edition of old manga, you have to scan from old books and magazines. And printing in magazines, of course, is not ideal because they use rough paper and the ink is cheap and it kind of bleeds a lot, right? It's like kind of a fuzzy line to it. And sometimes, they're really expensive, the magazines, and sometimes the books are expensive. So Brian was talking about, the curvature is that, to produce a good facsimile, you need to break the binding, right? And some collectors don't want to do that for understandable reasons because it won't have any resale value. So, but also sometimes on the flip side is that this doesn't apply to these projects, but I've done other projects where we need to create new data from an old book, and you ask a Japanese party, how much will you sell the data that you used for your edition? And it ends up being $500 to $1,000, whereas we could just spend $300, buy an old edition and destroy it, which is much to the horror of collectors. But in terms of a business perspective, it's $300 is obviously less than $1,000, so why not do it, right? And these aren't books that will never be found again. It's not like we're destroying the only copy that exists, as far as we know. But so there's different things you got to do to do older comics and manga.
I think this page is also is a good example of something that Ryan and I do that's different than the manga that we translate and the projects we've done is different than the manga that you're going to find at Barnes & Noble. For example, the sound effects being, to us, we're presenting these, with a Viz book or something, a Junji Ito book, for example, they're going to replace the sound effects because they want you to read that comic without thinking that it was first in Japanese, maybe, because of course they keep it in the right to left. But they want you to read it without any hiccup or whatever. And there's totally, that is totally valid. But we kind of have thought we're presenting these more as like historical documents, and so we try and keep things, anything that feels hand drawn or on purpose, like that the artist is drawing these sound effects with emotion and feeling. So we keep them as opposed to, taking that raw and just making it giant and trying to use a font and have it. So it's just a little different thing that comes into like maybe the Ryan Holmberg thesis as to like the comics that he's putting out and presenting, rather than the ones that are just being put out into like the mass market.
So something I'm notorious for is adding really long historical essays to the end of the translated editions I do.
Another thing you won't find at the Barnes & Noble manga section.
Because they know better. But this one also has one. I don't know why that's so illegible, but this one has a really long one outlining the early history of Fukui's life, the artist's life, but also the early history of martial arts and judo manga and how a lot of things originated from there. And in the same way that the production of translating and scanning the manga took a lot more work than we had anticipated initially, this one took a chunk out of my life, and I think I'm still recovering about how much time this one took. So I haven't been writing much these days to kind of recuperate. We'll come back to this in a minute. But that kind of also informed how we decided to do our next book. artist named Maruo Suihiro. He's well known as an artist of, erotic horror, essentially, starting in the 1980s. So we did an edition of this. I won't be writing for it, but we licensed this. Maruo is well known amongst more cult audiences in the world. Been translated extensively in Europe, but not so much in the United States for various reasons. The last translation of his that came out was, I think, 2013, called The Tale of Panorama Island from Last Gasp? No.
Yeah, I think it was.
But that was won an Eisner. I think it went through a second printing, but then they won't reprint it for whatever reason. So there's a real demand for Maruo that's only being serviced at this point by scanlations. So we decided to go for it. Pretty gruesome manga at parts. So we decided to do Maruo Suihiro. This was really, Brian was really wanting to do this artist. So I have a large network of contacts in Japan, editors, publishers, agents, artists also. So through that, we were able to license a collection of Maruo's early work. You want to say something about this book? This will be out in February, I think.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. Well, this is just an artist I've really always enjoyed. He's not for everybody, so please, approach with caution, adults only. But he's a huge cult figure, and I always was really jealous that there's 7 or 8 French editions of a bunch of his work, and that I was always like, why not English? I think the first time I met Ryan in 2019, I asked him, "Where's the Maruo? Like, why not Maruo?" And so, and I can understand why his comics are grotesque and can be violent, and he's climbing out of a toilet, if you didn't know what's happening in that scene, and so it's very gross, and so it makes sense. But I also think that comics and art doesn't, it shouldn't be censored, and people can choose what they like and what they don't want to read. And so I think that we should have the chance to put out some Maruo. And I'm excited. It's going to be it's a really cool book. It's 16 short stories, all from mostly the early 80s, some of his earliest work when he was in his 20s. And so, yeah, it's going to be exciting. It's finished. And so we're just working at the logistics of the printing at the moment.
I'll just make one last comment and then open it for questions. But I mean, it's interesting. We did these 2 vintage shonen manga that were made for good little kids in Japan, good little boys in Japan, and now we're kind of moving into the world of bad bigger boys, and see what follows from there.
Well, once again, the thesis is I want to publish things that I don't think I'm competing. I'm a hobby publisher. This isn't my job. I have other day jobs. I work. So I mean, it's something I really enjoy doing. But I'm trying to publish things that I just want to be out there. I want to put the book out there that I wouldn't. If someone else was going to put this book out, I wouldn't fight with them. I'd be like, let me just buy the first copy. So, but I guess I'll start with asking you, because I think that.
Audience Q&A too.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just
go ahead.
ask you for the audiences, like, I know that we've put out these books, and maybe people are wondering, like, why you choose some of the books that you choose. I mean, of course, like, we chose these kind of, like we're talking about how there's not much stuff published in the 40s, but like, why did we choose this one, or why did you choose any of the books that you chose to, Ryan has done 40, maybe something like that, books, and it's certainly shined a light onto a different scene of manga in English, more of the alternative artsy manga. And so I was just curious about, like, where you started and what
Sure.
kind of stuff that you try and go for.
I mean, it's always kind of like a rolling top 10 in my head. So, but you can't always license the manga that you want. So you just kind of sometimes just get translate what's possible at the given time. But the case with these 2 books, at least, is kind of didn't start off that way. Bat Kid was like supposed to be a one-off, but once you do one, you kind of realize that what's the next point in the history that you're trying to tell, right? And the next point is this, and then after you've done this, like, what's the next point of that? So there's oftentimes not necessarily thinking about series, but I oftentimes think about what would be the natural next project, right? So that's the case for this series, and I think also with the Maruo, we've talked too. It's like, what would be the natural next book after the Maruo if we open that door, you know? So it kind of worked that way a lot of times.
Yeah. You can show the one other book that you have a slide for it. I'll just shout this one out. This is the only other book now that you know the entire publishing of Bubbles is. This is a artist named Anand. He goes by a mononym, and he is from Delhi, India, and he's an artist that he followed my Instagram, and I looked at his Instagram and thought it looked cool, and I bought his first comic, the first of the series Zoo. His first comic maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I was just blown away with how good it was. I mostly just bought it because I thought it'd be fun to review something from India. Like, I'm always casting my net wide. I want people to buy Bubbles and go like, wow, he's reviewing a mini comic from India. Like, but I didn't realize it was going to be like the best mini comic I'd read for that issue. And then when the second one came out, I was more blown away, and I said, man, we got to just do a collection. And his comics were already in English, so they were like, it was a pretty easy book to put together. So then he did a third issue, and with that third issue that's what's here. It's like 120 pages, 8 short stories, and he's just a really amazing, strong storyteller. And he's someone who I didn't think really anyone in North America was like hip to yet. Like maybe a few people I had distributed some of his comics. Like I was like, can you mail me 10? I just want to put them on my web store. And now I think that people do know who he is, and he was at Short Run last year, which is a festival like this in Seattle, and that was the first time he'd ever been to America. And so yeah, it was just another cool project, another person that I just thought no one else was paying attention to, and now it's great, and I hope he moves on to a real publisher now, someone with better distribution, and I'm just really proud that people even know who he is, and that people agree with me that I'm not crazy thinking that his comics are amazing. So
yeah, it's good. I mean, another field that's really underexplored both as a research subject and publishing endeavor is Indian comics. So it's good that you put one out. Fantagraphics put out one this year as well. So
yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. Well, I think they're bringing you a mic. Wait, they're bringing you a microphone behind you. There you go.
All right, thank you so much. Well, I do have a question, and I'm very curious of how was the process of getting close to Japanese, Japan in general, and how do you go and get close of very hidden information, like the authors, the manga artists are very old, almost lost. So how is the process?
How is the process of contacting them and working
Yes,
with them?
the content, the information. How do you find information when it's very hidden?
In my case, I started off as a historian and a researcher. So I had met, and I wrote mainly about the 1960s and 70s. And a lot of those artists are still alive, quite old, but still alive. So I had interviewed them for some of my past research, so I knew them personally. And the thing is that a lot of those artists, they're not represented by big Japanese publishers, which I bring up because big Japanese publishers, they control the artists that they work with. So like any artists that are published, say, with Kodansha USA or Viz or whatever, they're controlled by the Japanese side publishers. And those American companies are their subsidiaries. So there's no access to them. So one way that I've done it is just by either knowing editors who know artists or knowing the artists themselves and licensing the projects that way. I also have, for stuff in which the artists are dead, and sometimes even the work is in either public domain or they don't know who the rights holders are. I ask through my network of editors and collectors if they know of anything about how to get in touch with people. And then more often now, Japanese know that manga is popular overseas, obviously. So there's more and more agencies that are getting into manga licensing. Typically, it was very few agencies that did that, but people like literary agencies, they're starting to learn that as far as book licensing goes, manga might be more lucrative for them. So some of them have started to get into agency licensing for manga as well. So I go through them a lot, and they're really good talking to Japanese publishers and stuff. Because sometimes just me cold calling or cold emailing someone is not always convincing, you know. So it's good sometimes to have a Japanese agency as an intermediary to make the process seem more commercially viable. The truth notwithstanding, but yeah. Yep.
Another question?
Yeah. Go ahead. Front. Go ahead.
Okay, I didn't know how I was getting mixed.
Yeah, it's okay.
I know you guys talked a bit about the technical difficulties with Ikaguri and the problems scanning and just image quality.
Yep.
Yeah.
Have you guys run into any specific issues with translating the word choices or unusual anything to do with dialects, just stuff that's really been difficult to work around?
Well, think about translating dialogue. Most manga comics are mostly dialogue, and most manga is mostly dialogue. The thing about older manga, partially because it was designed for a young audience, like maybe middle school or younger, the Japanese is pretty basic. And the other thing is that even when manga matured in the 1960s and the 70s, the language that was used was not attempting to mimic kind of street slang or schoolyard slang, always. Manga now is much more slangy, much more colloquial than it used to be. So as far as translating goes, translating older manga, in my opinion, is much easier than translating newer shonen manga. So I have a real respect for the people who translate manga for younger people now, because I don't know young people's slang in English. It's I'm definitely not going to know what it is in Japanese, so I can't necessarily.
Can you translate "skibidi toilet"?
What? No, so it's I don't. Not only can I not necessarily understand what it says in Japanese, I don't know the proper equivalent in English. So I'm thankful that I translate crusty things from the past. But
Hi there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have the. Hey. Okay, 1, 2. All right. But I was hearing about what you were saying about translating sound effects so that they still look raw and what the intention was from the original artist. And it got me remembering about, this is not a Chinese person, but R.F. Kong's Babel and the power of translation. And I was wondering, how do you balance that with the creativity that goes into projects making your post into a book that you can distribute,
Yeah.
versus using that same creativity and energy to maintain what the original illustrator wanted within while you're translating it. So balancing creativity versus the responsibility of translating a language.
Sure. I think I know what you're asking. Another factor in this, I'm not sure this is directly answering, but another factor in this is just the amount of labor that's required sometimes in relettering sound effects. Sometimes it can be really tricky, So it's a balance of not only what you're talking about, accuracy versus respecting the original aesthetic design, but also sometimes just kind of labor costs and time are also a factor. But I think our working philosophy was what Brian said, present them as archival material. But I'm not really sure if I answered your question.
I also think that something is worthwhile is when you're working on a project like this is that we're aware that when Batkid was first printed, it was printed for a market where it was thrown away, just like old comics were in America. Marvel comics were, and so we're trying to present the book even better. We want to stay true, and we want it to look nice. But sometimes even Ryan's books, I think a great example is a book he did called Baby Boom with Breakdown Press. That book looks, in my opinion, better than the Japanese version, and it's because they were we want to push it even further. We want to do better printing. And it's those kind of things that's you're paying tribute to what it first looked like, but you also you want to do it even more justice than, because we have such a reverence for some of this work that you want to do even better. So it's a balance, I guess.
I think are we out of time?
Yeah.
Okay. Fortunately, we're out of time, but We'll stick around, not here. We can chat a little bit outside the auditorium, but Brian,
Yeah.
Bubbles also has a table upstairs. I don't know what the number
I'm
was.
at table 134, so all these books are for sale, and please feel free to come and talk to us. We'd be happy to answer more questions if you guys want to talk. That's what we're here for.
All right, thanks for coming.